In October 2022, a federal agency walked into the middle of one of cable television's most beloved renovation shows, and what they found inside 5 Maine cabins changed everything about how the crew was allowed to operate. The announcement came from the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and it was not a private conversation. It went out in an official press release, naming the company behind the show by name, spelling out exactly what had gone wrong, and confirming that a financial penalty had already been paid. For a show that had spent 6 seasons convincing its audience it was the most honest, most authentic renovation crew on television, the timing could not have been worse. The company at the center of it all was Kennebec Property Services LLC, the legal business behind Maine Cabin Masters. And the violations the EPA alleged did not involve bad workmanship or unhappy clients. They involved lead paint, old homes, and a set of federal rules that had been on the books since 2008 that the company had apparently not been following at 5 separate renovation sites. The questions that followed were obvious. How did this happen? Did the homeowners know? And what exactly had the EPA discovered inside those cabins that triggered a formal federal enforcement case against a show that was, at the time, airing on national television to millions of viewers? To understand the full picture, you have to go back further than 2022. You have to go back to where this entire operation started, and to the man who built it from the ground up in the woods of Maine. Chase Morrill was born on Christmas Day 1977 in Augusta, Maine, and he has never really left. He is, by his own description, a 10th-generation Mainer, someone whose family has been working the same region of New England for generations before him. His grandfather was a civil engineer. His grandmother handled plumbing on their family camp. His father, Eric Morrill, served in the Army, built things with his hands, and raised Chase by putting a hammer in his son's grip as early as he can remember. One of Chase's earliest memories, which he has spoken about publicly, involves sitting on a rough-cut floor deck with a group of cousins, all between the ages of 5 and 10, their job being to straighten out nails that had been pulled from the original family camp. That was not unusual. That was just how the Morrills operated. He eventually attended the College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine, where he earned a degree in human ecology. He was already collecting salvaged materials before graduation, going through what other students called trash and seeing reclaimed wood, old boards, things that still had life in them. For his senior project, he renovated part of an old mansion on campus into a student lounge. The instinct was already fully formed. After college, Chase co-founded a construction company and worked on finding abandoned properties, renovating them, and selling them. He eventually formed a more focused operation with his sister Ashley, who had developed skills in interior design and graphic design, and Ashley's husband Ryan Eldridge. That core became the working unit, Chase leading the builds, Ashley handling design and aesthetics, Ryan doing carpentry alongside longtime crew members Matt Dix and Jared Baker. In 2016, a production company reached out. They were looking for builders in Maine who specialized in restoring old camps and salvaging as much original material as possible. Chase said yes. His sister and brother-in-law said yes. The rest of the crew said yes. The show premiered on January 20, 2017, on the DIY network. By the 3rd season, it had over 3.5 million viewers per episode. It was the top-rated program on the entire network. What made it work was exactly what people kept saying in interviews. It felt real. No manufactured fights, no fake deadlines blown up for drama. Just a family from Maine rebuilding cabins with people who actually lived in them. What nobody watching in those early seasons knew was that the same company producing those feel-good renovations would eventually find itself in the crosshairs of federal regulators because of what was hiding inside the walls of the homes they were being paid to fix. The cabins that Maine Cabin Masters worked on were, almost by definition, old, rustic properties in the Maine woods, camps on lake shores that had been in families for decades. Many of these structures had not been significantly updated since the mid-20th century, and many were built before 1978, the year the federal government banned lead-based paint for residential use in the United States. That cutoff date matters more than most people realize. Any home built before 1978 is presumed, under federal law, to potentially contain lead paint. When renovation work disturbs those surfaces, sanding, scraping, cutting, removing walls, lead particles become airborne. Lead dust can settle in living spaces and remain for years. In children, lead exposure can impair brain development and cause permanent damage at even relatively low levels. This is not contested science. It has been understood since at least the 1970s. In 2008, the EPA created the Lead Renovation, Repair and Painting Rule, the RRP rule, specifically to govern how contractors handle renovation work in older homes. Under the rule, any firm doing this kind of work must be certified by the EPA. Each project must have a certified renovator assigned to it. Homeowners must receive a specific EPA-approved pamphlet explaining lead hazards before the work begins, and the company must keep records demonstrating that all of this actually happened. These requirements are not ambiguous. They are not hidden in fine print. They are a standard part of operating a renovation business in the United States, particularly one that specializes in old homes and structures, exactly the category that Maine Cabin Masters worked in almost exclusively. In 2020, Kennebec Property Services LLC carried out 5 renovation projects at residential properties that had all been built before 1978. According to the EPA's formal complaint, at all 5 of those sites, the company had not complied with the RRP rule. Specifically, the EPA alleged that Kennebec had failed to obtain the recertification required before beginning the work, had not assigned a certified renovator to any of the 5 projects, had not provided homeowners with the required lead hazard information pamphlet, and had not kept the records that federal rules required them to maintain. This was not a single oversight at one job site. It was a pattern across 5 separate renovation projects. The EPA initiated its formal investigation sometime in mid-2021. The inquiry lasted into 2022. When it concluded, the agency brought a formal enforcement action, and the settlement that followed put the violation on the public record. The settlement between the EPA and Kennebec Property Services LLC was announced on October 18, 2022, in an official press release from the agency published out of Washington. The company agreed to pay a civil penalty of $16,500. The settlement did not include an admission of guilt, which is standard in civil enforcement cases of this nature, but the company also did not contest the findings. They paid, and then they agreed to something that went well beyond writing a check. As part of the terms, Kennebec Property Services was required to include lid safety information in at least 3 episodes of the upcoming season of Maine Cabin Masters. They were also required to address the topic on at least 1 episode of their podcast called From the Woodshed. And they were required to post information about the EPA's lid safety rules on the company's official website. In other words, the show itself became part of the remedy. Millions of viewers who watched Maine Cabin Masters in the seasons following the settlement would watch episodes that included information about lead paint safety, content that existed specifically because the EPA had caught the company violating federal rules and required this as a condition of the settlement. The EPA also pointed out in its official announcement that Maine Cabin Masters was not the only renovation show to face this kind of enforcement action. The agency specifically named other programs that had aired on the same network and had faced similar RRP-related cases, including 2 Chicks and a Hammer, Magnolia Homes, Texas Flip and Move, and Rehab Addict and Bargain Mansions. The EPA was making a point. It was actively monitoring renovation shows that worked on older properties, and it expected compliance. The acting administrator for the EPA's Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance was quoted in the official press release with language that left very little room for interpretation. Lead exposure in children, the agency stated, is extremely dangerous and entirely preventable. Since being contacted by the EPA during the investigation, Kennebec Property Services obtained the required RRP firm certification and committed to full compliance going forward. The operational changes were real, but they came only after a federal agency had already completed its investigation and brought the case to a formal conclusion. The penalty itself, $16,500, was relatively modest compared to the maximum amounts the EPA can seek in civil enforcement cases. But the conditions attached to the settlement created something the fine alone could not: a public record, tied to a nationally broadcast show, requiring that show to educate its own audience about the rules it had broken. There is something worth sitting with here, because the surface-level story misses a larger context. The Maine Cabin Masters crew, Chase, Ashley, Ryan, Matt Dix, Jared Baker, are consistently described by people who have worked with them and by fans who have followed the show for years as genuinely skilled, genuinely honest, and genuinely committed to the philosophy of respecting old structures. Chase Morrill, in multiple interviews, has talked about the importance of salvaging original materials, of not tearing out what can be saved, of keeping the character of a place intact. That approach is not performed, it shows in the work. The EPA violations that surfaced in 2022 were not about the quality of the renovations. They were not about fraud or reckless disregard for the homeowners they served. They were specifically about compliance documentation, the certified renovator assignments, the pamphlet disclosures, the record keeping. These are administrative requirements that exist alongside the physical work, and falling out of compliance with them does not necessarily mean lead dust was spreading unchecked through someone's living room. It means the company was not following the system that federal regulations require precisely because the consequences of that dust can be catastrophic. That distinction matters, but it does not erase the core fact. The renovations happened, the homes were pre-1978, and the required procedures were not in place. What the fans watching in 2020 did not know was that while Chase and his crew were working through what appeared on screen to be a smooth, professionally managed renovation operation, the underlying business had let its federal lead safety certification lapse, was not assigning certified renovators to the affected projects, and was not giving homeowners the information they were legally entitled to have. The people who owned those 5 homes may not have known what was, or was not, happening on a compliance level. The EPA release did not identify the properties or the homeowners. The show had been airing for 3 full years by 2020. It had built an audience that trusted the crew precisely because of how it presented itself. That trust, it turned out, was operating alongside a certification gap that a federal agency would later need to formally correct. The settlement did not stop Maine cabin masters. That is one of the facts that makes this story more complicated, not simpler. In January 2022, the show moved from the DIY network to the Magnolia Network, which had been launched by Chip and Joanna Gaines' company through a deal with Warner Bros. Discovery. The transition happened the same year the EPA investigation was reaching its conclusion, though the settlement was not announced until October. The move to Magnolia was, by most accounts, a good fit. The network's emphasis on authenticity, on craftsmanship, on real people doing real work, aligned more naturally with what Maine cabin masters had always been trying to do than DIY Network's more action-driven approach had. Season 9 premiered on Magnolia in the fall of 2023. The episodes that followed included the lead safety content the settlement had required. The crew, now fully certified under the RRP rule, was operating differently, compliance integrated into how the jobs were managed rather than treated as something separate from the renovation work itself. In 2023, Chase Morrill began a project that had nothing to do with Maine. He purchased a property in the municipality of Fasolto, in the Molise region of Italy, a remote mountainous area roughly 3 hours from Rome. The asking price was $97,000. The property was a 5-bedroom structure set on 7.4 acres, with 4 balconies and views that the crew eventually nicknamed the Balcony House. It sat on a hill, it had an olive grove, and it had not been seriously updated since around the 1960s or 1970s, which meant it needed the same kind of full system overhaul, new electrical, new plumbing, structural review that the Maine crew had spent years doing at home. The project was documented in a 6-episode spin-off called Maine Cabin Masters Building Italy, which premiered on Magnolia Network on June 17, 2024. Chase's wife Sarah, their 4 children, and the core Maine crew, including Ashley, Ryan, and Jared Baker, were all part of the renovation. Italian contractors handled the structural work because local seismic regulations required it, but the Morrill family's design and project management approach was applied throughout. The spin-off became available for streaming on Max and Discovery Plus in August 2024. The pivot to Italy was not a departure from what the show was. It was, in a way, a confirmation of the philosophy Chase had been operating under for years: find something old, treat it with respect, bring it back without stripping out what made it worth saving. Season 12 of Maine Cabin Masters premiered on December 29, 2025, with a 2-part episode filmed in the remote North Maine woods at a location called 9 Mile. The season ran through March 9, 2026, covering 10 episodes. Projects included a storm-damaged cabin rebuild in Monmouth, a ski shack renovation for a local high school, and a generational camp restoration for a 92-year-old homeowner on a private island. When Season 12 concluded, Magnolia Network had not yet announced a Season 13 renewal. For several months, the show existed in the category that TV trackers label as fate to be determined. Not canceled, but without a confirmed path forward. It was the longest the show had gone without a network commitment since it first aired in 2017. In May 2026, Magnolia confirmed that Maine Cabin Masters would return for a 13th season, with the premiere scheduled for Monday, May 25, 2026. The season opens with an episode called Restoring an Island Legacy. 13 seasons represent something that relatively few reality renovation shows ever reach. A run that now stretches back nearly a decade, through 2 different networks, a federal enforcement action, a global pandemic, and a spin-off filmed on another continent. The core crew remains the same: Chase Morrill, Ashley Morrill, Ryan Eldridge, Matt Dix, Jared Baker. The company is operating under full RRP certification. The lead safety content required by the 2022 settlement became part of how the show talks about renovation work in older homes, which is, essentially, every project they take on. What the EPA investigation forced, in a way, was exactly the kind of transparency that the show had always claimed as its core identity. The audience watching in 2020 trusted what they were seeing on screen. The settlement 2 years later put the gap between that trust and the operational reality on the public record. And the remedy attached to the settlement required the show to spend its airtime correcting that gap, to use the platform that the EPA had caught violating federal rules as the same platform through which the public would be educated about why those rules exist. The story of Maine cabin masters and the EPA enforcement action is not, ultimately, a story about a crew that set out to put families at risk. The documented record suggests the opposite. A team that had built a genuine reputation for honest, careful work, and then let the administrative side of a critical health safety requirement slip. But the requirement existed for a reason. Homes built before 1978 contain lead. Lead hurts children. The rules around it are not paperwork, they are public health infrastructure. What changed after October 2022 was both operational and public. Kennebec Property Services got certified, trained its people, and documented its compliance. Maine Cabin Masters committed its platform to lead safety education, and the show kept going through a network transition, an Italian spin-off, 12 seasons and counting, and a renewed 13th. Chase Morrill is still in Maine. The crew is still pulling salvage boards out of old camps and turning them into something worth keeping. Season 13 is underway. The question this story leaves open is not really about lead paint rules or federal settlements. It is about what accountability looks like when it comes for something people genuinely love. The crew did not disappear. They did not fight the EPA's findings in court. They paid the penalty, agreed to the conditions, and kept building. Was that the right way to handle it, or should more have been said publicly and sooner?